Some people wear their power like a crown, shining it for all to see, while others wield it like a weapon, sharp and dangerous, cutting down anyone who dares to defy them. Brenda Holtz was the kind of person who lived for control. She didn't just run the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, she ruled it like her own personal kingdom, smiling sweetly to people's faces while quietly crushing anyone who stepped out of line. And for reasons that still baffle me, she decided my wife Rachel was going to be her next target. It all started with one word. No. That was it. Rachel had politely, calmly, and without even a hint of hostility, declined Brenda's invitation to join her precious HOA. No drama, no debate, no explanation. Just a respectful, "No thank you, we're not interested." For most people, that would have been the end of it. But for Brenda, it was an act of rebellion. And Brenda didn't tolerate rebellion in her empire. That first visit to our house felt almost surreal. I still remember the sharp rap of her knuckles on our front door, each knock carrying this sense of urgency, like she was summoning us to face judgment. When I opened the door, Brenda was standing there holding a thick binder stuffed with HOA bylaws and community guidelines, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Her expression was pinched, her lips pursed so tightly they were almost invisible, and her eyes locked onto Rachel like lasers. "This is unacceptable," she hissed, her voice rising as she flipped open the binder and jabbed at a page like she was pointing to scripture. "We have 100% participation in Cedar Ridge. Everyone contributes to the quality of life here. Everyone." She emphasized that last word like she was spitting venom. Rachel, bless her, just stood there with this calm, almost amused smile, hands folded loosely in front of her. "We appreciate the offer, but we're not interested," she said, her tone polite but firm. It was like tossing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. Brenda's entire face turned red, her jaw trembling as she barked, "You'll regret this." And then she stormed off our porch like an angry queen retreating to plot her next move. What I didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't just a disagreement over HOA membership. To Brenda, it was a challenge to her power, a direct insult to her authority, and in her mind, it couldn't go unpunished. That was the spark that lit 3 straight weeks of harassment, a campaign of petty fines, whispered rumors, and outright lies that threatened to destroy not only our reputation but also our peace of mind. Looking back, there were signs of who Brenda really was, even before all of this happened. Neighbors who smiled a little too tightly when she walked by. Conversations that stopped cold when she entered a room. A subtle undercurrent of fear in how people interacted with her. But I hadn't paid attention then. I thought we were moving into a quiet, picturesque community where people cared about each other, where you could wave to your neighbors and feel safe. I didn't know that the person running it was the kind of control freak who would rather burn the whole place down than let one family say no. A few days after that first confrontation, Brenda came back, knocking on our door again. Only this time she was even more wound up. Her face was flushed, her breathing heavy, and she clutched that binder like a weapon she was ready to swing. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" she demanded, voice rising to a screech that made my stomach clench. "We maintain property values, we ensure community standards, we protect investments. That's what this HOA does. And you think you're too good to be part of it?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Rachel just placed a gentle hand on my arm and stepped forward. "No, Brenda," she said, steady as a rock. "We simply choose not to join." Her voice was calm, even kind, but her words landed like a punch. Brenda froze for a moment, her eyes twitching as she processed what had just been said, then leaned forward, lowering her voice to a chilling whisper. "You don't understand how things work here. People who don't cooperate, they learn their lesson quickly." The air between them was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. I wanted to say something, to push Brenda off our porch, but Rachel simply smiled and said, "Have a nice day, Brenda." That was it. Just 5 simple words, but they landed like a hammer on Brenda's fragile sense of control. She spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering to herself, fists clenched tight enough to leave nail marks in her palms. And I knew in that moment we had just made an enemy who wouldn't stop until she felt she had won. By the end of the week, the first citation arrived in our mailbox. Lawn height violation. Grass exceeds maximum allowable 2.5 inches. Fine, 100. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh because I had literally mowed the lawn the day before, leaving it looking like something out of a landscaping magazine. But laughter quickly turned to anger when I realized this was no accident. This was Brenda sending a message, and it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, more citations followed, noise complaints about music that wasn't even loud, accusations of improper parking when our car was perfectly within regulation, even a notice about unauthorized garden decorations because of a simple ceramic gnome by our walkway. It was relentless, and it felt coordinated, like Brenda was using the entire HOA as her personal weapon to force us into submission. Meanwhile, our once friendly neighbors started keeping their distance. People who used to wave as they walked by now looked away. Conversations that used to end with, "We should have coffee sometime," were suddenly curt nods and excuses about being busy. It was like a switch had flipped, and all because one woman couldn't handle the idea of someone saying no to her. I found myself pacing the living room late at night, staring at those citations and feeling my blood boil, ready to march over to Brenda's house and tell her exactly what I thought of her little power trip. But Rachel, as calm as ever, was quietly tucking each citation into a folder and taking notes, her expression unreadable. When I asked her why she wasn't furious, why she wasn't fighting back, she simply said, "Trust me, let her keep going." At the time, I thought she was crazy. I thought she was giving Brenda exactly what she wanted, a chance to push us into a corner. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that Rachel wasn't just taking the abuse quietly. She was preparing for something far bigger, something Brenda Holtz couldn't even begin to see coming. The days after that first citation rolled in felt like living in a slow-moving storm that just wouldn't pass. At first, I tried to laugh it off. One fine for lawn height? Whatever. It's a mistake, right? Maybe Brenda was just blowing off steam and we'd all move on. But by the very next day, another letter arrived, stamped with the same HOA logo that had seemed so friendly in the welcome packet when we first moved in. This time it was a noise complaint. According to the citation, someone had reported excessively loud music from our property at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The reality? I'd been inside, typing up a freelance piece, with soft jazz barely audible over my laptop fan. The complaint felt like a joke, except there was nothing funny about it because attached to that complaint was a $75 fine and a warning about repeat violations. Rachel skimmed it, sighed, softly, and then filed it in the same growing folder she kept in our kitchen drawer. She didn't even look angry. She just looked prepared, like she'd expected this exact thing to happen. The following day brought another blow, this one claiming we had parked illegally in our own driveway. The HOA rules clearly stated vehicles had to be parked on concrete, not on lawns or sidewalks, and we had been meticulous about that. I had measured the distance from the sidewalk myself. There was plenty of clearance. Yet here we were again, slapped with a $150 fine and a vague warning about potential towing for non-compliance. When I brought the letter to Rachel, she didn't even flinch. She just tucked it into that folder and said the same thing she'd said before. "Trust me, let her keep going." And that was when I started to realize this wasn't a case of random mistakes or overzealous enforcement. Brenda was building a case, trying to drown us in citations until we either joined her precious HOA or broke under the pressure. By the end of the week, we had 7 citations totaling nearly 400. They were ridiculous, almost laughable if not for the fact that they came with actual legal weight behind them. And it wasn't just the letters. Something had shifted in the neighborhood itself. People I'd chatted with at the mailbox a few days earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. Parents who used to let their kids play on the sidewalk near our yard now ushered them away quickly, glancing nervously back at our house like it was cursed. It felt like the air itself was turning against us, thick with gossip and judgment. I could almost hear Brenda's voice echoing in their heads. "Those people are trouble. They're not like us." One evening, our neighbor Jeff, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself, stopped me as I was taking out the trash. He glanced around like he was afraid someone might see him talking to me. "Hey man, just wanted you to know. I didn't complain about the noise thing. None of us did. I think Brenda's, making stuff up." He looked embarrassed just saying it. I thanked him, but his words confirmed what Rachel had already suspected. These complaints weren't from neighbors. They were from one person, Brenda herself, using the HOA as her personal weapon to bend us to her will. And through it all, Rachel was unnervingly calm. Each letter went straight into that growing evidence folder. Each whispered insult from neighbors seemed to roll off her like water on glass. When I finally lost my patience and demanded we do something, she just looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Sometimes the best way to deal with people like her is to let them think they're winning." It didn't make sense at the time. How could letting someone run roughshod over us possibly end well? But Rachel had this air about her, this quiet confidence that made it hard to argue. So I bit my tongue and trusted her, even as things went from bad to worse. Week 2 is when Brenda escalated her game to a whole new level. It was no longer about citations, it became personal. That Monday, a community-wide email went out from the HOA Boardwell, technically from Brenda but dressed up to look official, warning about a household displaying hostile and disruptive behavior that threatens the harmony of our community. It didn't name us directly, but it didn't have to. The wording was vague enough to avoid legal backlash, but obvious enough that everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. If anyone witnesses further inappropriate behavior, it read, "Please report it immediately to ensure community safety." Community safety. Like we were criminals. I saw the shift immediately. Neighbors who'd already been hesitant now actively avoided us. Children who used to play tag in front of our house suddenly detoured to the opposite side of the street. A couple who had waved just days earlier crossed their arms and turned their backs as I walked past. Brenda had effectively branded us as pariahs, and she did it with the click of an email button. That night, I slammed one of the citations down on the kitchen table so hard the papers skidded across the surface. "She's destroying us, Rachel. We can't just sit here and take it." Rachel, who had been quietly organizing the day's mail, paused and looked at me with a soft, almost sad smile. "I know it feels that way right now," she said, her voice steady, "but sometimes you need to let people dig their own holes. Trust me, 3 more days." Her voice cracked slightly on those last words, like she was holding something back. I'd never seen her look vulnerable before, and it made me hesitate. She was human after all, feeling the sting of isolation just as much as I was, but for some reason, she seemed willing to endure it. For something. In those days, the harassment went from annoying to suffocating. I started noticing subtle things, like trash mysteriously blown into our yard, footprints across our flower beds that hadn't been there before, and a broken mailbox hinge that hadn't just come loose on its own. And every time I thought about confronting Brenda, I'd see Rachel quietly documenting everything, taking photos, dating each citation, keeping meticulous notes. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked one night as she clipped another violation notice into her folder. She gave me a look I'll never forget, part determination, part something almost secretive. "Because when people abuse power, you don't stop them by shouting louder," she said softly. "You stop them by making sure there's nowhere left for them to hide when the truth comes out." By day 12, the social isolation had reached a breaking point. Rachel's coffee meetups with neighborhood women, something she had loved when we first moved in, had completely dried up. Even our friendliest neighbor, Clara, suddenly had other plans every time Rachel invited her over. It was like we had been branded with some invisible scarlet letter, and no one wanted to be caught associating with us. One night, I exploded in frustration. "I feel like I don't even know you anymore." The Rachel I married wouldn't just stand there smiling while someone tears our life apart. "Are you my wife, or are you some stranger who likes collecting harassment as a hobby?" I regretted it as soon as the words left my mouth, but I couldn't take them back. Rachel just sat quietly for a long moment before stepping outside onto the porch, looking out at the street. There was a heaviness in her shoulders I'd never seen before, but when she finally turned back to me, there was still that same strange, steady confidence in her eyes. 3 more days, she said quietly. "And then you'll understand everything." I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know what she was planning. But for the first time since we'd moved in, I realized Rachel was not just taking the harassment, she was preparing for something bigger, something final. And Brenda, she was too busy celebrating her own power to notice that her own downfall had already begun. Rachel's calm during those first 2 weeks hadn't been the calm of someone beaten into silence. It had been the composure of someone quietly playing a much bigger game. While I'd been fuming over every fake citation and every sideways glance from our neighbors, she had been carefully, methodically building something I didn't even understand at the time. One evening, I noticed her sitting at the dining table, surrounded by a stack of papers and a laptop open to what looked like financial spreadsheets. She quickly closed the file when she saw me and smiled softly, almost like she was embarrassed to be caught. "What are you working on?" I asked. She hesitated just long enough to make me suspicious, but then said, "Just some consulting work for a client." That didn't seem unusual. Rachel had done accounting work before, but there was something about her tone that made it feel like a half-truth, like she was telling me only the smallest fraction of the real story. That night, I overheard her on the phone while she paced the porch, her voice low and deliberate. "Target is escalating. Yes, timeline might need to move up. Backup is ready if needed," she said, pausing to listen, then replying with, "Understood. I'll have everything packaged before Friday." I sat frozen in the living room, wondering what those words even meant. Target, timeline, backup. She didn't talk like an accountant. She talked like someone coordinating an operation. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. When she left to run errands, I looked through that folder she'd been filling with HOA citations and photos. But it wasn't just citations. There were copies of invoices, receipts, bank statements from something called Elite Property Services, and even notes about meetings Brenda had attended at the city council office. Rachel's handwriting was sharp and precise, filled with things like 75-0 build versus 8-0 work done, see attached photos, and cross-reference with shell company filings, registered to Holtz's brother-in-law. My heart started pounding as I realized this wasn't about harassment anymore. Rachel had been investigating Brenda. When she came home and saw me sitting there, folder open in front of me, she didn't get angry. Instead, she set her keys down slowly, looked at me with those steady eyes, and said, "I was hoping you'd wait until I told you." I stammered, "Rachel, what is all this? What are you doing?" She took a deep breath and sat across from me. Brenda isn't just a bully with too much time on her hands. She's been stealing from her own neighbors for over a year. Those 75-0 landscaping upgrades, they cost 8 grand tops. Everything else goes through fake shell companies connected to her family. That HOA money everyone's been so proud to pay? She's pocketing it. I was stunned. So what? You just decided to, what, become some kind of detective? Rachel shook her head slightly and smiled, that same mysterious smile she'd been wearing since this all started. "No, I already am one." I blinked. "What?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I'm not exactly who you thought I was. My work, it isn't just financial consulting. It's investigations, mostly white-collar crimes, sometimes local government corruption. I take assignments quietly, because if people know who I am up front, it compromises everything. Moving here wasn't an accident, Mike. I came here because I already had complaints from 3 other neighborhoods about Brenda's HOA fees. I needed to live inside the community to see it firsthand. I sat back, my mouth dry. My wife, the woman I thought spent her time balancing budgets and doing tax prefab, been living a double life as an undercover investigator. "So this whole time, you knew she'd come after us?" Rachel nodded. "People like Brenda always overplay their hand. Power addicts can't resist it. All we had to do was say no and wait. She'd do the rest." For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel proud, scared, or betrayed. "You could have told me," I said quietly. Rachel reached across the table, took my hand, and squeezed it. "If I told you, it would have changed how you reacted. I needed this to feel real for both of us so she wouldn't suspect anything. But it's almost over, Mike. She's about to make her biggest mistake yet." That mistake came on Friday morning. Brenda had been getting bolder by the day, pushing every button she could find, and apparently, her patience had run out. That morning, she dialed 911. I didn't know it then, but later I would hear the recording. Brenda's voice, trembling with fake fear, telling the dispatcher she believed her neighbor-me wife was armed and dangerous, that she had made threats and might hurt someone if police didn't intervene immediately. She invoked her position on the city council, demanding urgent action. It was a performance, dramatic and convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth, but she had no idea she had just pulled the pin on her own grenade. 30 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled quietly down our street. Deputy Kim stepped out, his face calm but alert, clearly expecting to find some sort of domestic dispute. Rachel was already waiting on the porch, her posture calm, her face unreadable. I was jittery, pacing behind her, my stomach tied in knots because no matter how false the accusation was, False accusations have a way of spiraling out of control. "Ma'am, we got a call about some threatening behavior," Kim said, looking between us, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Rachel tilted her head slightly, almost like she'd been expecting this exact line. "Of course, Deputy," she said. Then she paused, letting the silence hang for a beat before asking, "Do you recognize me?" Kim blinked, taken aback. "Should I?" And that was when she reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather badge wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining sheriff's star. "Sheriff Rachel Cole, County Law Enforcement," she said, her voice cool and measured. Kim froze, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. "Sheriff, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea this call was about you." Rachel gave him a small, knowing nod. "I figured you didn't, but you'll want to stick around. This is about to get interesting." And right on cue, Brenda came marching across the lawn, her expression full of smug triumph, holding her phone like a trophy. "Officer, finally, arrest her immediately. She's a danger to this community," she barked, pointing at Rachel like she was identifying a criminal. Kim glanced at Rachel's badge again, then back at Brenda, and I could see the confusion on his face turning to disbelief. "Ma'am, do you know who you're talking to?" Brenda frowned, her confidence faltering just a little. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. That woman is out of control, and as a city council member, I'm demanding you remove her before she hurts someone." Rachel stepped forward slowly, holding her badge high enough for all the neighbors who had gathered to see. "Brenda Holtz, I don't believe we've been formally introduced," she said, her tone professional and calm. "I'm Sheriff Rachel Cole, and you've just filed a false police report against the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in this county." The silence that followed was almost physical, heavy and thick, broken only by the soft gasp of one of the neighbors recording on their phone. Brenda's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words but couldn't find any. Sheriff. You're the sheriff?" she finally stammered. "Yes," Rachel replied, her voice steady as granite. "And every single harassment citation, every fabricated violation, every dollar you've stolen from these people is documented and ready for prosecution." She gestured toward Deputy Kim, who was now standing straighter, his own expression hardening as he realized he was witnessing something big. "Deputy, please escort Mrs. Holtz to the station for questioning on charges of filing a false police report, harassment, and financial fraud. I'll be following with the evidence package." Brenda sputtered, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is entrapment. You lied about who you were. I'm a city council member. You can't treat me like some criminal." Rachel didn't flinch. "No, Brenda. You did this to yourself. You chose to harass us. You chose to abuse your position. And now, you're facing the consequences." As Kim stepped toward Brenda with handcuffs, the neighbors began murmuring, pulling out phones to capture the moment. I stood there in shock, watching as Brenda's world collapsed in real time. 3 weeks earlier, she had seen Rachel as an easy target, just another quiet resident she could bully into submission. Now she was realizing she had been harassing the one person in the entire county, with both the power and the evidence to destroy everything she'd built on lies. The moment Deputy Kim slid those handcuffs over Brenda's wrists, the entire street seemed to fall silent, except for the metallic click that sealed her fate. It was the sound of power collapsing, of someone who had built their life on intimidation suddenly realizing there was no way out. Brenda froze in place, her eyes darting around at the growing crowd of neighbors now gathering at their fences and driveways. Many of them had their phones out, recording what they instinctively knew was history in the making for Cedar Ridge. Brenda's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but all that came out was a weak, You can't do this to me. I'm on the city council." She said it like it was a shield, as if the title she'd wielded like a sword for so long could somehow undo the reality of being arrested in her own neighborhood. Rachel, calm as ever, stepped closer, her badge still visible as she addressed the crowd with the same composure she had shown since the very beginning. "For the past 18 months, Brenda Holtz has been stealing from this community under the guise of HOA fees and maintenance costs. Every inflated landscaping invoice, every fabricated fine, every sham company she funneled money through is documented. Today, that stops." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces were stunned, others angry. But all of them were focused on the woman who had spent years portraying herself as the champion of community harmony. Frank, the neighbor from across the street, stepped forward and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is that true? Brenda, is that why our fees kept going up every 6 months?" Brenda twisted in Kim's grip, her eyes wild as she spat back. "Don't listen to her. This is a setup, she tricked you all." But Rachel simply held up a thick manila folder and opened it, displaying spreadsheets, receipts, and photographs like she was presenting a case in a courtroom. "That 75-0 landscaping project?" she said, turning the documents so people could see. $8,000 of real work. The rest went through a company owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. 3 separate times in the last year and a half, the same scam was run. That's $200,000 taken directly from all of you. The crowd gasped, and the energy shifted. The nervous silence gave way to outrage as neighbors began talking among themselves, checking their own phones and emails, no doubt pulling up past invoices and HOA statements. One man shouted, "She said it was because of increased supply costs. We trusted you, Brenda." Another woman shook her head in disgust, holding her child close as if she couldn't believe she had ever taken orders from the person now standing there in cuffs. Brenda tried to pull away, but Deputy Kim held her firm, his voice professional yet cold. "Ma'am, you need to remain calm. You have the right to remain silent." For once in her life, Brenda had no clever retort, no cutting remark, nothing but a pale face and trembling hands. Rachel didn't stop there. She walked to the edge of our lawn, facing everyone who had gathered. "This isn't just about fake citations or harassment. This is about someone using power to silence anyone who wouldn't fall in line. My husband and I became targets because we said no. But how many others here have stayed quiet because you were afraid of retaliation? How many people paid fines you didn't owe or fees you didn't question because you didn't want to be isolated?" Heads began nodding, eyes falling as people remembered moments when they had been too afraid to speak up. Frank looked like someone had hit him in the chest, whispering to his wife, "We should have questioned it months ago." Rachel's voice grew firmer, her words carrying a weight that felt like both justice and release. "No more. Today, we take back our community." As if on cue, backup patrol cars rolled in, lights flashing but sirens silent, their presence undeniable. Detectives emerged with clipboards and evidence bags, heading straight for Brenda's house at the end of the street. Another team peeled off toward the Elite Property Services office, where warrants were already being executed. It was clear now that Rachel hadn't just been reacting to harassment, she had orchestrated an entire takedown, one that involved financial crimes, investigators, prosecutors, and even the state's anti-corruption task force. Brenda's attempt to crush one family had exposed her entire fraudulent empire. She looked around at her neighbors, eyes pleading now instead of commanding. "You know me," she stammered. "You know I wouldn't do this." But no one spoke up for her. The same people she had intimidated into silence for years now stared at her with betrayal etched on their faces. Within the hour, Brenda was placed in the back of a patrol car and driven away, her once pristine image shattered. Some neighbors cheered. Others simply stood in stunned silence, processing the fact that the person they had feared was gone. Rachel closed the folder and exhaled, a quiet moment of release after weeks of calculated patience. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and whispered, "You did it. You actually did it." She gave me a soft smile, not the mysterious one I'd grown used to, but one filled with genuine relief. "No, we did it," she replied. "Everyone who stood up today helped end this. But I knew the truth. It had been Rachel all along, planning every move, every piece of evidence, every step that had led to Brenda's downfall." In the days that followed, the shockwaves were immediate. The HOA board dissolved entirely after members resigned en masse, claiming they had no idea Brenda had been skimming funds. Frank, with the support of nearly every household, was elected interim president and immediately implemented transparency measures. Rachel had suggested public budgets, independent audits, and open-door meetings where no question was off-limits. The first order of business was rescinding all of Brenda's arbitrary fines, refunding thousands of dollars to residents who had been unfairly penalized. When Frank stood in front of the community for the first time, he said something I'll never forget. "We let one person scare us into silence, and it cost us our money, our friendships, and our peace of mind." That ends today. From now on, Cedar Ridge belongs to all of us, not just the loudest voice in the room. The transformation was immediate. Neighbors who had avoided us during the harassment came by with baked goods, handshakes, and apologies. Clara, the friend who had ghosted Rachel during the worst of it, hugged her and said, "I'm so sorry. I was scared of her." We all were. Rachel just smiled and told her, "Fear only works if you let it. You're here now, that's what matters." Children returned to the sidewalks, laughter filling the air again as if a heavy cloud had been lifted from the neighborhood. What had once been a place where people whispered behind closed doors was now open and lively, built on a sense of community that hadn't existed under Brenda's rule. Brenda herself faced a harsh reality. With overwhelming evidence presented by Rachel and her team, charges of embezzlement, fraud, and filing false police reports were filed. Her assets were seized, her seat on the city council stripped in an emergency vote, and she was banned from holding any public office for 10 years. When her trial concluded months later, she was sentenced to 3 years in county jail and 5 years of probation, with full restitution to every resident she had defrauded. Watching her led out of that courtroom, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, because justice had been served, but also a sobering realization of how far unchecked power can corrupt a person. Brenda hadn't just lost money and status, she'd lost her entire identity. For Rachel, the aftermath brought recognition she never sought but fully deserved. The county sheriff's department awarded her a commendation for innovative investigative work, and state law enforcement invited her to speak at leadership and anti-corruption seminars. Articles ran in local papers about the sheriff next door and how an undercover operation brought down one of the largest HOA fraud schemes in recent memory. Residents from other communities reached out, asking for advice on handling similar situations, and 2 more fraudulent HOA networks were exposed because of tips linked to Brenda's case. One evening, sitting on our porch as the sun dipped low, I turned to Rachel and asked, "Do you ever regret keeping all of this from me? The secret life, the stress, all of it?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head gently. "No, because if you'd known, it would have changed how you reacted. I needed you to feel it as it really was. I needed her to believe she had control. That's how people like her fall, they think they're untouchable until they're not." I nodded, finally understanding what her mysterious calm had meant all along. Rachel hadn't just been waiting. She had been watching, planning, ensuring that every move Brenda made tied its own noose tighter. Cedar Ridge is different now. The fear is gone, replaced by a sense of connection we never had before. Neighbors greet each other with genuine warmth. Kids ride their bikes without being scolded for violating sidewalk space. And community events are run transparently, with everyone welcome. Even property values went up, ironically fulfilling Brenda's so-called mission, but this time through honesty, not intimidation. And sometimes, when I see Rachel sipping her coffee in the morning, peaceful and unbothered, I can't help but think about how one quiet refusal to join an HOA exposed a web of corruption and changed an entire community. Power had made Brenda arrogant, and arrogance made her blind. Rachel's patience, integrity, and willingness to stand firm turned all of that against her, proving once and for all that bullies only win until someone quietly stronger decides they're finished playing by the bully's rules.